This is a screencast for Activity 1 of Learning Package 1 of the module Building, Adaptation and Conservation, which is produced under the ORBEE project, that's Open Resources in Built Environment Education. For this activity you were provided with various scenarios and asked to think about the scenarios and the impact that they would have on the life of a building. And what I suggested is that in considering your responses, you think particularly about the idea of the life of a building. We started with the example in which I simply said that there's been a massive decline in manufacturing industry in the UK. A lot of manufacturing now takes place overseas, and so there's been a shift in the economy from manufacturing to services. We see this all over the country with buildings like these, which were constructed for specific industrial purposes, whether they are manufacturing purposes or to serve particular industries. Often these buildings are simply obsolete. They're out of date and they're old-fashioned. We could also argue that the buildings are redundant because there is really no demand for this type of building in the current climate. And so we could say really that the functional life of these buildings is at an end. But the physical life of the building is certainly not at an end, and assuming that the structure is basically sound, it could be put to alternative use. And here's an example of a former industrial building in Coventry which has been extended and adapted for use by Coventry University. So there are still possibilities for the building which can be found. So the first scenario that you were asked to consider was the changes that have taken place in shopping practices. And these have undoubtedly had a major impact on traditional town centres. There's been a massive growth in recent decades in out-of-town retail parks. These are popular amongst customers because people can drive to them, they can park easily, and if they've got heavy items to carry, they can put them straight into their cars and continue shopping at other outlets. But clearly, these do have an impact on town centres. Alongside this, of course, you also have to consider the massive growth in internet retailing, epitomised by companies such as Amazon, which of course will also have affected traditional outlets. And the results of both of these shifts can be seen in many town centres and high streets up and down the country, where trade is often declined and business is often relatively quiet. And many of the premises which are occupied are used for non-retail purposes. So we might find estate agents or financial services outlets. The buildings are not necessarily obsolete, though it could be argued that they are redundant. Their physical life certainly isn't over, but the way in which these problems have to be addressed goes beyond considering the buildings themselves, because this is really a policy issue which would have to be addressed through the planning system and other strategic incentives which might have to be provided to bring businesses back into the high street. The second scenario concerned changes in the way in which society deals with mental health. From the Victorian period onwards, there was a long tradition of dealing with mental health problems by institutionalizing the people who were affected, often in very large purpose-built asylums or sanatoriums which were set in extensive grounds in the countryside. Now the shift in policy to dealing with people who suffer from mental health problems in the community, the so-called care in the community policy, has meant that such buildings are effectively redundant. So again, their functional life may be at an end, but often they're quite magnificent buildings, and the buildings themselves, as in the previous example, certainly haven't reached the end of their physical life. Here's an example of one such institution, the Royal Holloway Sanatorium at Egham in Surrey, which has been reused for an alternative use. This building was redeveloped into luxury apartments, and the grounds were used for the development of townhouses. So effectively, townhouses were built in the surrounding grounds. The sale of those houses financed the adaptation of the main building itself, and the main building has been refurbished to a very high standard to produce luxury apartments. So a good example of an imaginative reuse of a building which was constructed for a very specific use back in the 19th century. The third scenario concerns buildings that have grown up alongside transportation systems, and whenever a new form of transport is developed, buildings are constructed to support it, and this is certainly applied whether it's horse-drawn carriages, the development of the canals, the development of the railways, roads, air travel, and so on. But as the transport systems evolve, the buildings that served those transport systems are often left behind. So what we find are buildings such as this, which is a railway shed built alongside a railway which is no longer in use, or canal side warehouses, often very busy places during the say 19th century when the canals were widely used for the transportation of goods, and these buildings were used for temporary storage of those goods. But now that the canals are rarely used for transporting goods at all, the buildings effectively become redundant. Similarly, here at Grimsby Dock, these are the buildings which serve the fish docks, but as the fishing industry has declined, so the buildings effectively become redundant. So again, their functional life has reached an end. In some cases, such as here, the physical life may also be certainly close to an end, but in many cases the buildings can be used for alternative purposes. So here's an example of a lovely residential conversion to a small waterside warehouse at Newbury in Berkshire. Here's an example we've seen before. This is Albert Dock in Liverpool, which has been converted into a thriving commercial development of shops, bars, restaurants and offices. And here's an interesting one. This is the former Great Western Railway sheds at Swindon, which now houses the National Monuments Record. So an interesting alternative use for a former industrial building. The fourth scenario concerns the changing population patterns which often have an impact on places of worship. It's common in both urban and rural areas that the local demographics might change. There might be an influx of immigrants, or there may be a net outward migration of the population. And this can have a significant impact on buildings which had been constructed as places of worship for the local community. Added to this, of course, society is generally becoming much more secular, so there's much less attendance at formal worship than in previous generations. So the result is that a lot of old churches have effectively become redundant. There is no longer a demand for the use to which such buildings were constructed for. However, as in previous examples, alternative uses can be found for these buildings. So in some cases, a church might be converted to serve the needs of another faith, such as this church in Wembley in northwest London, which has been converted into a mosque. There's also hundreds of examples of small churches and chapels up and down the country which have been converted into private dwellings, such as this conversion in Cheshire. And there are even examples of churches being converted into retail outlets, such as this one in West Kensington in London, which is shown here being used as a bed shop. And the final scenario concerned farming practices, which have undoubtedly changed over the last 60 years or so, and there's been a significant shift from small-scale, local, family-based farming activities to very large-scale agro-industry. The buildings which were constructed to serve old farming practices were often very small buildings which were indicative or representative of both the farming practices themselves and the local building practices and materials that were used. So, for example, this small building in Yorkshire, built of stone, this one in Wales, this particularly very dilapidated building in Lancashire, all no longer required for farming purposes, because nowadays a lot of very large scale farming depends on very big buildings to accompany it. So the scale of the operation needs much bigger buildings, such as this grain store shown here. So again, the functional life of these old buildings may be at an end, but the physical life in most cases isn't. And the size of these fairly modest agricultural buildings lends themselves very well to conversions, particularly for use as family homes. And here are just a few examples finally to illustrate this point. So the barns themselves often make excellent barn conversions for family dwellings. Thank you.